parsha, and the Torah tells us that as soon as he was born, the room that he was born in was filled with light. Now, a fundamental principle of Judaism is that we are judged and our character and our righteousness is based on our actions, not based on a predetermined notion. In other words, Moshe had to earn his righteousness. He wasn't born specifically righteous, or at least that's how it's supposed to be for everyone. So, what does it mean that that the room was filled with light? So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to connect the statement that the Jewish people are eternal. In other words, that God promised to them that they will never be destroyed and that they're going to survive all the trials and tribulations that they face until Mashiach comes, with the birth of Moshe and why that was crucial and what that represented to the eternity, to the, what's the right word here, to the not just survival, but to the indestructible nature of the Jewish people. So the first text that we have is from Rav Kook. Rav Kook is a rabbi that lived in the early 20th century, I think in the early 1900s. He was actually the only, just some historical perspective, he was the only Orthodox rabbi that endorsed Zionism in those days. And I want to explain why that was the case. Zionism in its very early days, in the early 1900s, packaged itself as a very secular movement that, especially in Eastern Europe, that let's move to Israel, and we could abandon all of the traditions of Judaism. We don't need that anymore. All we need to do is live in Israel, and then we don't need to keep our Judaism. So traditional Judaism countered that and felt that this is counter to what we believe, and there was a lot of dispute and contradiction. I'm not going to go too much more into that. And now, eventually, after 1929, after the horrific massacres in Hebron, which my family lived there for hundreds of years, my great-grandmother's family lived there for hundreds of years, and there were massacres in Tzfat and Jerusalem as well in 1929. And then everything changed with the Zionist movement, where it became about Jewish survival versus the religious aspect. And that's when the unity began between the different elements of Jewish communities, specifically between the Orthodox Jewish communities as well. Without going more into that, Rav Kook was able to embrace it from well before that. He was a great man, a very special man, very well respected, and he wrote many books. So this is a quote from his book. Yaakov strides forward with pride. This is a verse, and the winds and the tendrils of righteousness as his spirit rises across the world. He hears the ticking of hours and moments with a sense of perpetuity and eternity. He journeys onward with eternal strength and forges the flood of waves and flow of time. Days of sorrow, like a multitude of mighty waters, never frighten him. He knows their force is merely passing, while he derives strength and eternity and splendor from the source of all existence. With Hashem's might, Yaakov will be returned, and those who perished resurrected. His eternity will overcome the fleeting moments and the coalesce into days and weeks and pool into the well springs of eternity, the supernal sea of freedom, which obviously is referring to the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel and overcoming the trials and tribulations and the suffering that they faced in the world. Now, where does this come from? Where does the idea of Jewish survival and Jewish eternity come from? So let's go to what we started the class on. This is from the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that the moment Moshe was born, the entire house that he was born in was filled with light. And the Talmud goes on to prove it, that it says that his mother saw that Moshe was good. And the verse also uses the same term when God saw the light that he created, that it was good. And as we know, the light that God created was not the light of the sun. It was the light that he created for the righteous, the light of the redemption, the spiritual light. So that light was the same light that Moshe was bringing into the world when he was born, and that was the light that filled the room. The Medrash also tells us that it was only a 7th month pregnancy for Moshe, because he was he didn't need as much time to I guess become a full human being. I don't know more about that. Now, why does the Torah tell us this? What's the point of this? So before we go into this next text, and this is from the Jerusalem Talmud, but before we go into this, let's understand something here about Moshe and about free choice and about the Torah. I asked in the beginning of the class, how come Moshe merits to be born with this light? If the whole foundation of Judaism is that our character and who we are, whether we're righteous or the opposite, is dependent on our actions and our free choice, then a baby who's born, nothing happened yet. They didn't get a chance they didn't get any free choices yet. So why was the light, why was Moshe born with the light? In other words, why is it predetermined that he's going to be righteous? And God doesn't do that. So we're going to learn further on in the class that what was happening here was a reference to the fact that Moshe eventually would choose righteousness and that he would bring the Torah down from Mount Sinai to the Jewish people. And this is the light that the Jewish people would inherit or would become one with. And that light would become eternal for the Jewish people's survival. In other words, that light would keep the Jewish people alive and survive throughout the history until Mashiach comes, and obviously beyond. What does that mean? So we're going to get into a conversation a little bit about truth and about the idea of truth never changing and never being able to be disposed of. But let's talk about Moshe's birth for a second. And what we're going to do is, and I'm surprised that the authors of the class didn't put this text in here, but in the Purim story, which Purim is not too long, so we might as well talk about it. We're told, in fact, the word Purim, the holiday of Purim, means lots in Aramaic or Persian, or yeah, in Aramaic really it means a lot. What is the lot? Is that Haman or Haman drew lots on which month to destroy the Jewish people. And when he chose the month of Adar, he was happy because that's the month where Moshe passed away on the seventh day of Adar. And when the Talmud tells us about this incident that Haman drew the lots on the seventh of Adar, the Talmud says what Haman didn't realize is that Moshe was also born on the seventh of Adar. So Rashi explains what the Talmud is saying because, on the one hand, it doesn't make any sense. Haman's excited because it's Moshe's death, and the death comes after the birth. So why is the Talmud saying what Haman was outdone, or Haman is wrong because Moshe was also born on the seventh of Adar? Well, his birth was kind of undone by his death, so Haman really kind of is right. What's the Talmud saying? So Rashi comes in and says, very fascinating statement. Kedai haleda shetechaper al misa, that Moshe's birth was so powerful that it undid the pain of his death. And the Rebbe explains this, and this is what I want to talk about because this is a prelude to what we're going to discuss here in this class. And this is a very important concept. It's a little bit spiritual, a lot spiritual, but it's very important in terms of Jewish survival as well as the belief in the righteous of our people that keep us fueled with faith in God and connected to God. So Moshe being born was such a powerful impact on the world because of what he was going to do in the future by bringing the Torah to the people and being the faithful shepherd to the people. And because he did it in a way of truth, and the idea of truth is that it was the authenticity and the genuine essence of truth, which is God, and bringing that truth to the people through the Torah, it can never be undone. It can never go away. And that's why death for Moshe is not real death. When death could only take away something that was never really in existence in the first place. And that's why when a person passes away, it is only their physical bodily cells that go away, but the soul lives forever because the soul is part of God, and that doesn't that cannot that's truth. That's part of God that can never dissipate. So we may not be able to communicate with that person after they pass away, but they're still 100% in existence. They're just not in existence in our realm. Now, for most people who live in a physical way and their soul is kind of marginalized in their life, so when they pass away, since our relationship with them is very physical, and I say physical, I mean like, we know them as a physical being, we know them, through their physical existence, and more often than not, as human beings, we prioritize our physical life more than our spiritual life. So when a person passes away, their physical is gone, and it's very painful. But when a tzaddik passes away, since their entire life is godly and spiritual, even their physical is spiritual and godly, there's nothing really to go away. And therefore, their existence continues on, even though we don't see them anymore. But their existence in the world is sustained because they are in the character of truth with godliness and connected, and whatever they accomplish is sustained and lives on forever. I'm going to explain that a little bit more, and the text will explain a little bit more in a second. Now, if that's the case, that is what the Talmud is trying to tell Haman. You think you're picking the month of Adar because it's about Moshe's death. Well, guess what? Moshe was also born on that day, and therefore his birth basically accomplishes, his existence accomplishes, and his death wasn't able to take away anything that he accomplished. And therefore, there's nothing special about the fact that he passed away there, because nothing was taken away by his death. Nothing was really taken away by his death because his existence is eternal. So, having said that, where does Moshe's existence become eternal? This is very important. Moshe is not an entity of his own. That would be idol worship. What makes Moshe's existence eternal is not that Moshe is a separate entity. Moshe's existence is eternal is because he was connected to God through the Torah, and he brought the Torah to the world. And that same Torah, that same connection, Moshe gave us that opportunity to connect to as well. And that's why this Jerusalem Talmud says this very quote, that the evil empire flourishes when Jews hurl the Torah to the ground. In other words, when we don't respect the Torah, which is our life source, which is what makes us eternal, which is what makes us indestructible, then the evil empire, whatever you want to call the evil empire, in other words, whatever, call it evil, could flourish because now the strength of our eternity is weakened. And it gives a source, and you can trust, and you can cast the truth to the ground. The Torah is considered the truth, and it will do and prosper. Truth can only refer to the Torah, and it is written by truth and never sell wisdom, ethics, and understanding. Okay, let's now talk about the idea of truth and the idea of truth, truth being an everlasting entity versus sheker. So I want to draw your attention to the letters. We may have done this before in a class, but I want to draw your attention to the letters. Okay, look here on the screen. This is the word emes, which means truth. Right? There's the aleph, the mem, and the saf. Look at the bottom of each letter. The bottom is aleph, which has two legs. The mem has a flat bottom, as well as another leg, and the taf has two legs, which means that it stands. Another interesting thing about truth is that aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet, mem is the middle letter, and taf is the last letter, which means truth encompasses everything, and truth can never fall. Truth lasts forever. Sheker, now the thing about the shin, in the Torah, the shin has a pointy bottom. So the way the Hebrew letters over here is not accurate. It's more for print. But if you look in the Torah, the way that's written in the Torah, the shin has a pointy bottom. So sheker the shin has a pointy bottom, the kuf has uneven legs, and the resh only has one leg, which means sheker which means lie, doesn't have legs to stand on, and it doesn't have the ability to last forever. Now, let's go back to the text that we skipped. Um, Now, here's what it says. The world is called, this physical world is called the fraudulent world. For falsehood is another name for things that are transient. In other words, the false doesn't mean bad, lie. False just means that it doesn't last forever. In other words, subject to termination. All worldly delights are transient, as it is written, for the time of death, one cannot take everything. So it's important to understand that the idea of sheker or lie is not lie as in telling a lie, or false as in um evil. Like, we're not talking about that. The idea of falsehood here is temporary. Um, so for example, if somebody's in a relationship that is a temporary relationship, then it's not a real relationship. So if someone, let's say, says, I'm going to be in this romantic relationship for a short period of time, um, we all know that that's not a real relationship. It might be fun, it might be memorable, but it's not a real relationship. Even a business relationship that's not a long-term relationship is not a real relationship. Only a everlasting, eternal relationship could be a real relationship. The same goes for this physical world. Something that doesn't last forever cannot be considered truth. Truth lasts forever. And that's why when it comes to death, we know that we can't take our wealth with us. We can't take our physical items with us. What we could take with us is our good deeds, the mitzvos. If we do good deeds, or we learn Torah, that goes with us because that's truth and that goes forever. In fact, if we ensure that our legacy, that our funds that we leave over go and do good deeds, that actually adds to the truth of our legacy. In other words, truth, anything that's connected to Torah and mitzvos is truth, and that lasts forever. But physicality alone cannot last forever, which that's considered sheker. So it's not sheker as in bad, it's just temporary. However, truth, what makes something true is that it's eternal and unchanging. So, for example, in science, there are certain scientific principles that, in other words, here's what we know now based on the scientific research, but it could be undone based on new evidence, right? There are terms for this, but they're failing me now, but we all know what I'm talking about. In other words, it could be a medical discovery that, or a medical principle that we know that this and this is how the body works, until we find out with new evidence that this is actually a little bit, there's a new way to look at things. And the same goes for discovering the world. However, there are certain scientific facts that we know are never going to be changed because those are the facts of the world. How much more so in Torah, in godliness, in spirituality, there's a truth that can never change. And that's the truth that we want to be connected to. And this is the verse that we read before. This is from King Solomon, that when you tell the truth, or when you speak truth, or you're connected to the truth, it lasts forever. And the opposite is obviously the same thing. Now, I'm going to skip this text. Sorry. So, and this is actually important. So anything that is subject to change is false, meaning not false as in bad, or not necessarily false, but it doesn't necessarily have the sanctity of truth. So now, having said that, if truth lasts forever, so here's an interesting point of the end of days. If God created the world, God is the truth, right? God is essence. Sorry, God is everything, which means God doesn't have a beginning, he doesn't have an end. This world was created with time and place, which means that it's technically a false world because it doesn't have the true existence to it. So how do you put this world into perspective? So the Talmud tells us like this. The world will exist for 6,000 years. I apologize to those that this contradicts their worldview. We're just taking this to learn a practical lesson. So, however you want to take this information, that's up to you. So Rabbi Katina said that the world will exist for 6,000 years, followed by destruction, as it is written, God will be exalted alone on that day, referring to the coming of Mashiach. Now, the commentaries tell us, what does that mean? This doesn't mean that there'll be destruction. This is referring to the coming of Mashiach. This doesn't mean there'll be destruction and desolation, God forbid. Rather, the natural law that will prevail for 6,000 years will end, and it will be replaced by a new, much improved, beautiful environment with no negative properties. In other words, evil will be eradicated. There will be no grief, moaning, suffering, or negativity. Instead, we will enjoy only goodness and wonderful, healthy delights. And that's the idea of God will be alone, is that God will finally be revealed as the source of everything. So, how do we ensure, one second, before we go further, how do we ensure our survival for those 6,000 years is by making sure we're connected to God, to the godliness through the Torah that is unchanging. So here we have it in simple words. The world is described as false because it is temporary and will eventually be replaced by a higher enduring reality. So since truth is eternal and unchanging, anything destined to end cannot be considered truly real. Fine. Now, back to the Torah and how that actually does it for us as our source of eternity and source of survival. So it is clear and explicit in the Torah that the commandments remain forever without change, subtraction, and addition. This is why we can't change the Torah. We can't say the Torah is only relevant to certain eras and certain times, because the Torah is truth, and truth doesn't change. And the Barbanel says something interesting. The divine Torah, which is given by God, that is in our hands, is eternal and cannot change at any time. This is because the blessed God created it according to his unlimited wisdom, and the Torah is relevant to every person at every time because God's knowledge is not limited to any particular time frame. So how do we become eternal? How do we survive? How do we overcome the falsehood of the world, which every time we face a challenge and a difficulty and a threat to our existence, it's all coming from the falsehood of the world. It's by connecting to the eternal source that transcends the world and is the truth of existence. That's the Torah. We become an eternal nation through our connection with the Torah, by embracing and eternalizing its eternal truths. We connect to what's everlasting and we can transcend the transient nature of this physical world. So the Torah is what uplifts us and enables us to become the indestructible and eternal and there's a word I'm looking for about talking about like indestructible. There's another word. I can't think of it right now. But basically, in order to reach that level, we have to connect to the Torah. So here the Rebbe explains, and he explains it very clearly. And this is in return terms of Moshe and what Moshe brought into the world, going back to the house filled with light. When God gave us the Torah, he liberated us from the grip of death. Most people don't know this, but just like when God created Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden, so there was no death in the world. So when Moshe brought down the Torah on Mount Sinai, at that point, he brought the world to a level like it was, and not back to Adam and Chava, and even greater, where death was eradicated from the world. It wasn't until the golden calf that death was reintroduced. But at that point, we were living in a messianic world. We were living in a perfect world. So when God gave us the Torah, he liberated us from the grip of death. By giving us the Torah here on earth, he endowed us with a measure of eternality. Even as we resided in physical bodies subject to aging and decay, we would live forever free from the angel of death. However, this came undone when we worshiped the golden calf. For the Torah to imbue humans with eternity, it must be embodied in our physical experience. So the Torah can't just exist and then we exist. The Torah has to be one with us. We have to actually live the Torah. And because we worship the golden calf, even though it wasn't all of us, in fact, it was a minority of us. But because we're all connected and we're all responsible for each other, it brought us all down, and it brought the whole world down to a level of back to the falsehood of the world, and where godliness is not as revealed as it was meant to be. So the sin of the golden calf introduced an unholiness into our bodies, forming a barrier to holiness. And this prevented the Torah from being absorbed into our body. But because Moshe was the one who brought that opportunity down to Mount Sinai, and even with the golden calf, we still have the ability to connect to the Torah. And that connection is what guarantees our survival. Not only that, but it strengthens our survival. So it was Moshe, the light that he was revealing when he was born. It was that light of eternity, that light that God created when he created the world, that this is Ruch Shel Melech HaMashiach. This is the light of Mashiach, the light of the redemption, the light of the perfect world. It was Moshe giving us a glimpse of what that light is, and that we're able to achieve that when we receive the Torah. And by the way, that light is from Moshe's soul, because his soul is basically the priority of his existence. In other words, he has a physical body just like we do, but his soul is in charge of his body. So in fact, we all have that same soul, because it's the same God that we have a soul from. The difference is that our body is in charge, our animalistic soul, our animalistic self, and our animalistic soul is in charge of our godly soul, and therefore we're physical, we're very physical, and our physical instincts and our physical desires are in charge. But for Moshe, it was his spiritual connection to God that was in charge, and therefore his soul shone through his body. What Moshe is to us is a role model for what we could become, because we have that same soul of God within us. And we could become that, or at least we could tap into that, even temporarily, through Torah and mitzvahs. And while we may not see that light physically, knowing that it's there and knowing that we could reach into this, into ourselves, into the soul that is a part of God that's within us, that is what gives us the inspiration that it is possible. So, more about the light that Moshe brought into the world. So Moshe was worthy of illuminating the entire world with the Torah he would receive at Mount Sinai. So that we already talked about. And once again, because he came from the principle of truth. I can't stress to you enough why the word truth, or emes, is crucial in this conversation. There's a lot of spiritual elements and character traits that are a lot easier to talk about than truth, such as kindness, right? We all love kindness. We all like to do kindness, and very good. Truth means being true to ourselves and being connecting to the truth, and not allowing any element of temporary or even sense of inauthenticity or facade be a part of who we are. And that's very hard. It's very hard to be truthful, very hard to be authentic, very hard to be genuine. I mean, really genuine. And when I say genuine, I mean genuine to who we really are, to our godly soul. And this is the journey of a human being in this world, to connect to God, to the essence of who they are. And that's why truth is the model here that Moshe is setting for us. It's not enough to say, I want to be spiritual, or I want to be kind, or I want to be, and there's other character traits. There's becoming more mindful, there's becoming more present, there's becoming more, you could come up with a bunch of them. And that's what many spiritual leaders focus on, because that's what people want to hear. It's more comforting, it's more tangible, it's more realistic. But truth is what Judaism demands from us, is what the Torah demands from us. It doesn't mean we can achieve it so easily, but knowing that that's the bar, that reaching the level of truth, that what we seek is truth, and not settling for anything less than that, is what Moshe is bringing to the table here. And by the way, when we say truth, we're not trying to say truth versus lies. It's truth as in the essence, reaching the essence of everything, the core of everything, which is God. Okay. Um, this is the story. This is an interesting, we're bringing random texts here, but it's interesting. So this is a story from the Talmud. So we all know that Korach, when he rebelled against Moshe, with Dasan and Aviram and many others, so the ground swallowed them up. So the Talmud tells a story, and there are many commentaries on this story, but we're going to read it at face value. So Rabbi Bar Chana said, an Arab once said to me, come, I will show you the place where those were swallowed by the earth due to the sins of Korach. And he showed him two rifts in the ground. And by the way, there's a medrash that says that he actually gave him a stick with a cloth, and he stuck it in, and it came back burnt. But this part only has the part about he put his ear to the ground. Says, listen, what do you hear? And he heard them calling Moshe Emes v'Seirase Emes. That Moshe is true, and his Torah is true, and we are the frauds. In other words, Korach is the frauds. But wait a second, isn't it God's Torah? How are we saying it's Moshe's Torah? How are we allowed to say it's Moshe's Torah? So since Moshe completely devoted his life to God and devoted his life to the Torah, and Moshe was nothing from himself. So he is a nothing. He was completely selfless. So therefore Hashem credited him that Hashem called the Torah in his name because of his devotion to the Torah. But not that Moshe is an entity of his own, not that Moshe has an opinion of his own. Moshe was the role model for us to show us what it means to devote yourself to God and to the Torah. Okay. Sorry, what did I miss here? All right. So that was text 11. So when you internalize it, so now how do we tap into this? So when you internalize the Torah so completely that it becomes part of you, you don't merely possess the truth, you become it. And that's what guarantees our survival. So Moshe became the Torah itself and true and unchanging. So he was totally devoted to the Torah, and therefore he was one with the Torah. He wasn't his own entity. He was the same al Torah. The same as Torah. And the Medrash says Moshe devoted his entire life to Torah. Therefore, it's called his Torah, as it stated, remember the Torah of my servant Moshe, because Moshe was nothing for himself. He was completely committed to the Torah. Now, as far as truth, Moshe representing the truth never ends. And that's why we say that Moshe really never died, because the Torah that he brought to us continues to live throughout everything. And the Talmud says that Moshe didn't die. Why? Just as he served on Mount Sinai, he continues to serve today. He continues to teach us Torah today. And obviously, as the Rebbe explains in the next text, that it means that in every generation, Moshe is there's a leader that has a piece of Moshe in them to be able to continue his teachings. I want to share a quick two quick stories. One is that there was a rabbi who was touring England in the north of England, and he was touring the uh, uh, um, where the Romans when the Romans conquered England, they only went like up north to a certain area and then they stopped. I think it was near Yorkshire or somewhere up there. Basically, they reached like a certain point and then they stopped. And like this was the wall they built, and 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 they stopped there. And this was during the time the emperor of Hadrian, or I think his name was Hadrian, was the same emperor who killed the 10 martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur, including Rabbi Akiva. And then this same rabbi went to a yeshiva that was nearby, I think it was in Gateshead, and he walks into the yeshiva, and the first thing he hears in the yeshiva is one of the students is saying, Rabbi Akiva says, and he's quoting Rabbi Akiva from the Mishnah. And the rabbi is thinking, look, the Romans who conquered this land, they were conquered the whole world, they're nowhere. But the Rabbi Akiva, who they murdered, who they skinned alive, the students are still learning about what he says. In other words, his Torah, what he taught is still eternal, is still living. Another story I want to share is when Adolf Eichmann was captured by the Israeli intelligence in the 60s in Argentina, and he was brought to Israel for trial, and then eventually he was executed. So the executioner, who never executed anybody, but there was lots from the prison guards, and he was chosen to be the hangman. So it was very hard for him, and he had nightmares from it, and it was very difficult for him. Just was a young guy, he had no experience in this kind of thing. And this is in the 60s. In 2004, a German TV station wanted to interview him. And he said he'll be interviewed on one condition, that it be done in a yeshiva where they're studying Torah. And the German TV was like very upset because there was a lot of background noise. And this man said, well, guess what? That's the only way I want to show the German people that no matter what was tried to be done by Eichmann and his friends and his associates, this is what they tried to do to us. They tried to take away our Torah, but guess what? The Torah is still alive and well because it's being studied right behind me. So it is the Torah that keeps us eternal. It is the Torah that allows us to survive and thrive in spite of all the attempts to do away with us. And the Rebbe says over here, our sages taught that Moshe never died. It is in his nature and even his physical nature was truth. His earthly presence couldn't end and die. Truth is eternal even in the physical world. We can explain the immortality of Moshe like this. Our sages spoke of the extension of Moshe in every generation. This means that Moshe's soul integrates into leaders and sages of each generation. His soul is especially present in the leading spiritual giant of the generation, for there is someone like Moshe in every generation, as the Medrash tells us. The soul of Moshe integrates into the body of this leader. So therefore, Moshe's spirit continues in every single generation because truth can never die, it can never go away. And that's why whenever, if someone's teaching us Torah, we always rise because that person represents the truth, the godliness that is being taught and being connected to us through the Torah. So ultimately, this is the secret of our survival. This is the secret of how we're able to overcome all the challenges. This is the glue that holds us together, as a nation. And yes, not always have we been strong in connecting to the Torah, so we have to do everything we can to connect to the Torah and to internalize the Torah, become one with the Torah, and then we can reach that point where godliness is revealed with the coming of Mashiach. Thank you all so much. Thanks for joining, and I want to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.